Hello everyone. My name is Dave Miles. I'm the moderator and presenter today. I want to thank you for attending the webinar today. We're going to go ahead and get started now. I know that some of you on the webinar, I know you. I just want to reach out and say hello. It's good to see you out there. For those of you that I didn't recognize your name, I'm so happy that you're here this afternoon. I want to talk about today the IBA market database, the Biz Comps database, and the Done Deals database. And I really want to talk more about the hands-on experience. What is it that I'm trying to do when I get here? I'm not talking so much about the valuation aspect of those. This is more about efficiency in performing the job than it is about effectiveness in performing the job in a correct way. We have a couple pieces of housekeeping before we start. The first is that today's webinar is not counted towards CPE. There is no certificate of attendance, and there is a polling question at the end, but it's not really a polling question. So, you know, there are no polling questions, there's no certificate of attendance, and there is no continuing education for today's webinar. I tell you that up front so that if that's what you're looking for before the end of the year, you may need to choose another venue. There are handouts over in the handout column, and you can download those. In fact, the price of admission today is well worth it just by getting those Done Deals FAQs and those Done Deals field definitions. I'm having a very difficult time finding those on the internet these days, and those have come from a few years ago. So feel free to download those handouts, and if you can't download them, feel free to contact me. Again, my email address, dmiles@valuesource.com, and my phone number are the best ways to get a hold of me. I am willing to answer questions after the webinar today, and we'll go from there. In fact, that would be the last piece of housekeeping. If you have questions, feel free to type those into the question panel or the chat box, and I will get to those at the end of the presentation today. Today's presentation is the first time I've been through this, so I'm going to try to get all the way through it and then go back and handle the questions, which is a little different than what I usually do. So let's go ahead and get started. My background, I've been with ValueSource for over the last 15 years. I'm the domain expert. I'm the guy that goes between what the marketplace is saying and what it needs to the programmers and what they can do, and I'm trying to be that bridge. I'm a CPA, CVA. CGMA is a new designation that came out here in the last couple of years. I went ahead and participated inside of that. Where I really get my knowledge is that I talk to thousands of evaluators across the country, and as they're trying to accomplish their goals, I get to learn something, and I also get to share what I've learned before with people who are calling after that. And so that's been a real great experience, and I'm grateful for that. Prior to joining ValueSource, I was the CFO of a $80 million financial institution here in Pueblo, Colorado, and my primary goal over the last 15 years has been my family. I have two great kids. One's attending Duke, another's graduating from Pueblo West High School here this year, and he is a Betcher Scholarship semifinalist, and so I'm really proud of those two. I've been married for 32 years to a wonderful woman. Wouldn't have it any other way. So let's go ahead and talk about today's webinar. Quick overview. We're going to understand the history of these databases, IBA Market Data, Biz Comps, and Done Deals. And I always like to talk about the history because you know, knowing where the data came from and why it exists gives me some context into how I use this data. We're going to talk about how the data is accumulated and how it's built, and that should give you some more context of how it is. What that all ties into are some of the strengths and weaknesses of the databases that are out there. And when we go through and we try to sort and filter these different data sets, it's going to be an interesting task to see exactly what some of these strengths and weaknesses are. I'm going to use a BV Data World today. That is one doorway to get to the databases. KeyValueData.com is another, and I thought there was another one for Adam and IBA members to come in to get to the IBA data. Those are just the doorways to get to the same databases. These are the same databases and the same algorithms that you use to search and pull out of those databases. One of the things that I like about BV Data World is that we have analyzer tools, and I will talk about what those analyzer tools can do, and I will also show you some of the advantages of being able to use those analyzer tools and how they can help sort data and filter data to get you to a more appropriate proxy for a subject company. So let's get into this. Oh, I should probably also say I'm intending for this webinar to last about 50 minutes, 60 minutes, but I haven't been through it, so if it goes a little more, a little less, I apologize, but that's my plan. IBA market data. What is the history of this data set? I was talking to a friend of mine up in Boulder, and he was showing me how much the RMA books cost in 1982. That's a long, long time ago in 1982, and it was about $28. And we're going, wow, I wish my pay increased as much as the RMA book cost today. But when we go back to the 1980s, what we have is we have an individual out there. His name was Ray Miles. He put together the IBA, the Institute of Business Appraisers. And in the 80s, they didn't really have any databases. They didn't have anything. And so his real mark to fame is that he would gather this information and try to create these market spaces. And so he was the first to put together the database, and he called it the IBA database. I think it started out with like 4 fields, and then it went up to 7, and then it went up to 11. And so that's what his claim to fame is. And one of the strengths of the IBA market data is that all of those records have been retained. You can go back to the late 70s, early 80s, and see what market pricing was at that point in time. Now, another couple of the handouts that I have inside of the handout column, and I'll be happy to share with you, is his direct market data method and how to use the IBA database. What Ray believed is that you had a market space, and that there are companies that are worth more in that market space and companies that are worth less in that market space. And using the idea of a central tendency was inappropriate for him. To give you an example of what he was trying to say is if I have a pizza place on the south side of Pueblo and a pizza place on the north side of Pueblo, one has a lot of health citations, the other doesn't. One has a $5 pie, the other has a $20 pie. Those are different pizza places, and one commands a higher price than the other. And saying that they're both worth the same multiple is a misnomer. And that's really what he gets after in the direct market data method. And we have 3 analyzers that are included in the IBA market data. We have the analysis, which is a regression line, the idea of central tendency using sum of least squares method. We have that analysis inside of there. There's a histogram with that. And then there's a direct market data method. So let me kick on over here. Let me kick on over here to my, there it is. Sorry about that. So when you log into BV Data World, you'll get an idea of the different databases. And what I want to talk about today are these private market transaction databases. Now, you'll notice that Pratt Stats is not on our list. Pratt Stats is sold by BV Resources. It's exclusive to them. Some of the same ideas and strengths and weaknesses apply to them that also apply to these databases. Perhaps the biggest one that you'll have to worry about is whether it's an asset sale or a stock sale, and make sure that you get that down pat. But since it's exclusive to BV Resources, I am not going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about these 3 databases here. So let me come over to the IBA market database. There we go. And talk a little bit about how this is set up. Now, we came out with BV Data World, and it's a new look. We came out with this about a week ago, and so this is all pretty fresh. But up here it says when my subscription expires and how many exports I have remaining. An export is when you click one of the buttons down here at the bottom. When you click an X, one of your exports will decrease, and you'll have to purchase more of those unless you have an unlimited unlimited deal. So the first step is to search the database, and the second step is to look at the results of that search, and the third step is to get this out in a format you can use, and that would be the Excel pieces. We have a standard search and we have a detailed search. The standard search is what I want to talk about first, because what happens inside of here is what most people do. And the reason we know most people do that is because over the last 5 or 6 years we've said, okay, how do people use our databases? They come in and they use a SIC code search or a description search. So that's why we put this out here, to make it real simple and easy. As I said, one of the strengths of the database is that I can click on this all data. It's not defaulted that way, but I can go back for 30 years and pick up the last 30 years of stuff. If you do a search for CPA firms or accounting firms, you'll find that the price to revenue is right around $1 for the central tendency of that, even going back as much as 30 years. Obviously, that's not true for every industry. You can't use time as a thing for every industry, but it is interesting sometimes how far back you can go and still get valid results. The SIC code is listed over here on the left-hand side. And the way the IBA works is that you can put in up to six codes. So let me show you exactly what that looks like. You can tell that there's 2 20s and 1 60 here. So if I type in the SIC code 20 and press search, I'm going to come up with just those 2 manufacturings. If I put in 20 and 60 with a space in between the 2 and press search, I'm going to come up with that third business. And so if you're typing into a single box and you have 2 words inside of there, it's going to be, what is that, the OR condition? If you think about a Venn diagram, it's going to be both circles, not just the intersection. And so you have to type that into the box. On the other hand, if I type into 2 boxes, it's going to be the intersection of those. So let me come over here and delete that out and put in a description of manufacturing. If I type in manufacturing and type search, you can tell that I get a whole bunch of different items down here for different types of manufacturing. If I put in manufacturing and pub, because it's in the same box, I'm going to get that Boolean OR condition. In the Venn diagram, it would be both circles. And if I go to the last page over here, if I go to the far end of the page, you'll be able to tell that they have stuff down here with pub inside of it. So there's the pub, there's the manufacturing, pub for public accountant. So you can get an idea that when you type in a description here, you're picking up, does this contain that? And if it's in the same box, it's kind of a Boolean OR condition. So let me come over here to the detailed search and show you what that looks like. On the detailed search, you can choose again all data or last 10 years of data. You still have your SIC codes that you can type in here, and then you have your descriptions. But more importantly, what I can get to is I can get to specific dates, I can get to specific locations, and I can also filter this based off of those different parameters. And so let's say, for instance, I want to search for transactions that occurred in 2004. And like I said, I'm not trying to say why you would do this in evaluation. I'm just trying to say this is the tool that you can use. And so if I put in 12/31/2004 and I press search on this, it's not going to matter what the SIC codes are. It's not going to matter what the descriptions are. I have 17 pages, 1677. I don't know if you can see that over here. Let me highlight that. 1677 records. So that's how many businesses were sold in 2004. And I should probably show you how these filters work inside of the working pane. You can sort by this here, and you can make it go from low to high. So let me clear out all of my box, and so last 10 years of data, and hit search. And what I think is interesting is if I look at like the data sale and I go from high to low, you can tell that the latest databases inside of here are from July, June of 2016. If I want to sort by revenues, where is it? If I sort by sales and I go from high to low, you can tell that the largest data observation inside of here is pretty darn big, you know, $665 million. And if I go from the other end and I go from low to high, let me erase my little markers here. You can tell that there's some out there that don't have any revenues inside of here, and some that have $0 in revenue. $0 in revenue, but discretionary earnings of $373,000. That's something you're going to have to take a look at and make a professional judgment on. You know, is that an observation that I should include, or is that an observation I should exclude? And you're going to have to make that kind of determination. Something else you need to realize is that if I click on the details over here, I can see all of the different fields that are available to me. Now I'll get these out inside of Excel, and these will be columns, okay, and the data inside of them will be the rows. But you can tell that most of these transactions are only going to have a few data points. And you know, saying that you have comparability off of these 8 or 10 data points can be a real nightmare sometimes. Even looking at the business description. For instance, we'll have brokers that submit things and they put down a description, and then somebody else tries to figure out what the SIC code is. So somebody put down the description of printing, and really what they were in the business of is printing on t-shirts. They did screen printing, silk screen printing, versus a commercial printer that has a big $25,000, $50,000 machine that, you know, prints up these big signs and can do print jobs, you know, 1,000, 5,000, 20,000 pieces, and fold and stuff them into envelopes and get them out. Those are two different businesses, but in the business description it would both be saying printing. And so that's one of the drawbacks of all of these databases is that when you're looking at a particular item here, you know, what is really included inside of that? You need to realize too that brokers are doing their best to fill this out, but sometimes when they're trying to determine sellers' discretionary earnings over here, you know what I mean, they're going to do it the way they would sell the business, and not necessarily the way an appraiser might think about sellers' discretionary earnings. Is this really cash flow to the owner? And so you're going to have to decide, was this done or not? I know that the records, the observations are looked at for reasonableness, but they are not audited. And so that is, that's also a weakness of all of these databases. And I'm not talking about just IBA market data here. Same thing happens with Biz Comps and Pratt Stats. And so you have to be a little careful out there. There are definitions for each of these fields, and you have to be aware of those, what's included in the price, what's not included in the price. Not really going there for that today, but I wanted to talk a little bit about that for some of the strengths and weaknesses. So let me come over here to my standard. Let me do my all data, and let me try plastics. So if I want plastic manufacturing and I type in the word plastics, you can do a search on this. And you can see that I will come up with 29 records. And some of these are 3089, some of these are 2821s, and there's different numbers in here. If I wanted to get two of these, I could put in 3079 and 3089 and press search, and it would come up with the SIC codes for both of those. Now you need to understand inside of I thought 3079 was a code here, but it looks like I'm only getting 3089s. You need to understand that you can only have six SIC codes. The other thing I'm not sure I said is that if you push in just the first letter, if you push in just 3, it's going to come up with nothing because it's looking for an exact match of 3. That's going to be different inside of the Biz Comps database, and that would be a contrasting detail. So I believe the search that I have, the last 10 years, 3089, I have something like 21 records. When I click on the data only, I'm going to get an Excel sheet that has just the fields inside of it. I have a spreadsheet that will show you that. And then if I click on analysis, I will get an analysis sheet. And I believe that when that occurs, this is what will come up, and you'll be able to download a sheet. Now the problem or not a problem, what you have to understand is that we use macros in the background on this Excel sheet. So if you cannot run Excel macros, say for instance you're on a Macintosh, then this analysis tool isn't going to help you very much. But if you're on a regular Windows machine and you allow the macros to run, the first is you enable content saying that I can run these macros, and now you get the ability to run macros in the background. And I'll show you what those do in a second. The next tab over is the extended data. You remember how I said all of those fields would be the rows and the columns would be the labels of those fields? That's what the extended data is. This is the tab you get if you do just the data only. And the reason we provide that is for people who can't use macros for whatever reason. So they can get out there, they can get the data, and then they can use that data inside of their models. What most people are looking for is this little area over here called the summary in the purple. That summary allows you to get most of the fields and the fields that are important to you, and you can come out here and you can do your own, you know, if I want to do a percentile, I can calculate it. If I want to do a median, I can calculate it, and you can move forward from there. One of the issues that we have inside evaluation is to decide which transactions to use and which ones to exclude. And so we have two tabs down here on the bottom that do that for us. So we have select transactions, and then we have the selected transactions. So let me erase my drawings and let me get rid of this comment. The comment is for, it says what I'm going to tell you here in a minute. So over here in column B, if I put a 1 inside of there, it's going to show up for true. If I put a 0 inside of there, it's going to show up for false. And so that's how I would exclude items, is I would put a 0 out there. And that seems pretty easy. You know, we have a huge price to seller's discretionary earnings here of 31.18. I'll show you what that does to the graph here. We also have one out here that has a negative discretionary earnings, and I'll show you what that does to the graphs in a minute. We have a tools tab, okay? Well, let me start here by saying you have the zeros and ones, and then the next tab over, transactions selected, is just going to bring over the ones with the true. And we use this table to calculate all of the graphs and all of the charts and that information. And I'll get to that in a minute. But that's what this particular tab is for, is to say, look, these are the transactions that we used. Now this tools tab is pretty cool. Let's say that you download a very, very large population. You can download all of the restaurants all at once, and you can download all of the dentists all at once. And if you do that, you're going to get a huge, huge number of records. I'm thinking it's in the number of the thousands. And it's not going to be just 20 where you can look at 20 rows and decide if you want it or not. So the way these work is that you can right-click to change the values. And if I press select all, and sometimes I get ahead of myself. So I took off the only use ones with multiples inside of there, and right now I'm going to choose the select all. If I clicked on the select all, it will go in and select all of those transactions. So now if I go back to my select transactions, you can see that all of these have been changed to ones. And so it will help me understand that those are all selected at this point. That might be a beginning point. Select all of these, and then I'll discount the ones that I don't want and pull those out. Another cool part of our tools is that I can sort by. So I'm over here in the sort by piece. Ooh, new color. But I can sort by, let's say, sales, business description, price, sales. And I can choose the order. Do I want it ascending or descending? So typically I like mine descending so I can see the ones on top. And then when I right click on the place, it's going to say sort the transactions. When I go back to my select transactions, we should be able to see that the sales have been ordered. And that might help me discover orders of magnitude. And I can also go back to my Tools tab, and I can use the Select Criteria. In other words, I can put in I can put in a small number here and a large number here for sales, and then it would give me, you know, that as my selection. So these items out here just help you manage the workbook. There's some help buttons down here that go out to the internet and will help you understand what things are defined as. And you can use these other two here to display workbooks and charts. If you don't want to see them, you can hide them. So as I understand it, I have 21 transactions, and I believe I have selected all of those because I want to include these weird ones, the minus and the big 3118 out here. So the next tab over is, once I've selected those, is a grid. Now I'm an accountant and grids make sense to me. So this top one is going to give me all the transactions, whether I selected them or not, and the bottom one is going to give me just the transactions that were selected. And so I can go through here, and for sales, I can see my range, 119 to 4.3. I can see my average sales is 1.9. If I was looking at price to sales, I have a range of 0.1 to 1.0 basically. I'm kind of rounding here a little bit. I can see what my median is compared to my average. It's pretty close on that, so I'm not too far apart. But you can see that this 31.18 is dragging my arithmetic average way up. However, the harmonic average is calculated here automatically. Now I have to admit, sometimes the spreadsheet comes in and you got to dink with it a little bit. So sometimes this here will be squeezed over, and I don't know if you can tell or not, we have a little numbers here. And that's simply the way Excel brings in stuff. So all I do is pull that out, and I can get my number to show up. Okay, the next tab over is trying to take the asset value that's generated in IBA and Biz Comps and convert it to an equity value. So you would type in information from the subject company, and you would come over here to the next place, and it's going to say, what do you want to use? Oh, here again, we get to use the drop-down list, harmonic mean, whatever's calculated over there, and it will calculate for you the add-backs that you've typed in. So you know that the price is an asset price. It doesn't include accounts receivable, doesn't include real estate, and you add all of those back and you take off the payables that are associated with it. That's what those two tabs are for. Now this idea of limits, this is the direct market data method that I was talking about, where Ray Miles would say, hey, there's a value out there and I'm somewhere in between those values. And so this is how they calculate those limits. And you can look at this and you can say, oh, here's my 10%, here's my 25%, then it calculates that against the high and low price, and it creates a little chart for us. And so the first chart here is price to sales, and it's just set up to be the scatter plot. Sometimes we use the lines. This here is the 25%. So basically, you know, the way I use this is I say, okay, I would be on this line here if I had a high-priced business. I would be on this line here if I had a low-priced business. The next tab over has the 10% limits on it. And the way I look at that is if I'm using an income method and I want to justify my value, and I'm using IBA market data to do that, anything above this 90% or anything below this 10% is an extraordinary situation, and I would have to really consider the value that I was producing if that was where I was at. And here again, you know, it gives you the other two lines that are in place here. I want to go over here to the next schedules and show you what analyzer tools do for you and what analyzer tools don't do for you. So you can see that we have that negative amount inside of here, and so it's going to show up as a dot. And what that means to us is that when we start to do our scatter plots, and we start to, whether this is a regression line or whatever, we're going to get some negative values. Now when you got negative values, you have to worry about your covariances, and covariances are not supposed to have negative values. So what I'm trying to say here is that the expertise and the judgment that you have to use is still very, very needed and has to be there, because, you know, we can put anything on a spreadsheet and model it, and that doesn't mean that the model is using correct inputs, and that's really where we're at. So you would probably want to go back and exclude those and see what's going on. But I wanted to show that to you. And so The idea behind the direct market data method is that, based off of price to discretionary earnings, price to revenues, you can get an idea of where you sit in the marketplace. The scatter plots help explain that at a much deeper level, and all of that is generated pretty much automatically based off of how you selected those transactions. And that's what the macros do, is they pull that out of there. Now let me go back and let me pull out my 21 records by using just the analysis tool. So let me open this, and when I download it, it's going to say, oh, okay. So let me open just the analysis tool. Came off of the internet, so I have to say okay, and then it's going to ask me, do I want to enable my macros, and I press enable content. Let me let everybody catch up. And when I press enable the content, I get all of my data. So if I come over here and I'm going to change all of my data to ones. Now, the first part of this book is exactly the same. Here's the transactions I'm selecting from. Here's the ones that I chose to use. Here's the tools. I can use the tools if I want to. The statistics are the same. Here's that coefficient of variation. It's 1.93 on this one here, and you can look at that and say, wait a minute, where do I need to be with that? But what the analysis does that the direct market data method does not do is it has two pieces in it. The first is it provides a histogram. It might have three pieces, but it has a histogram. How many transactions are occurring in a specialized bucket? What that says to me is that if I have 5 transactions out of 20 transactions occurring in a certain price range, I'm probably more likely to tend to have a value in those 2 buckets. And that's what the histogram can help prove, especially if you're using the market data methods or the market methods to support an income method. The other thing that we do is we create a y equals mx plus b with an r squared number. So let me get rid of those so you can see that a little bit better, but that's what that is. So this line here is a regression line. It is the sum of least squares, and it's trying to minimize the distance between the points and the line. So I kind of think of it as a median, but it's not a median, and that's not the definition of it, but it kind of gives you an idea of here's the part in the middle. And so if I had a particular value of revenue, wherever that is, I would come up to that line. The way I determine that point is I put my X number as for the revenue, and it will tell me exactly what the multiple should be. And that's the nice thing about this is that it gives you some confidence with an R squared number. 0.38 is not a real good number, but we have that one super high number that's causing some problems, and could be our judgment going on there. It does not have those limits on it. So let me go over here. The other thing this does is that this has price to sales over sales. So it has what is my ratio compared to the base. And these are usually downward facing things. If you want a tidbit of information, Fred Hall is a business broker out of California. If you look up Fred Hall Business Broker California, you can come up to his page, and he has some nice new ways of analyzing data from these data sets. And what he does is he's going to take the discretionary earnings and put it over the other one to come up with, oh my goodness, here is the profit margin. And he uses the profit margin to generate a pricing multiple. And it's very interesting, and it's very, very accurate. Well, I don't want to say accurate. What I want to say is that it fits our models better than the two that we're using now, just using revenues and discretionary earnings. And if you've ever tried to reconcile those two and say here's what these two are, they're usually pretty far apart, and the reason is because you're not taking that profit margin into account. So we do have the price to sales over sales, or price to discretionary earnings over earnings, and that will give you an idea as to how those are looking. A good example would be the price to discretionary earnings over earnings. I thought this was a flat graph, but I guess not. And then we have our histograms. So in this case here, we only have 2 transactions occurring in a certain place. Not really helpful. You know, looks like there's a little consolidation there and a little consolidation there. And if I had multiples in those ranges, it would make sense to say, look, it's here supports this. It's more likely to transact at these prices than the other ones. That doesn't mean you need to use all of these analysis every single time. We're just saying that it's automatically generated in the background. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. The next data set is Biz Comps. Now, Jack Sanders is on the other side of the country. Ray Miles was out in Florida. Jack Sanders was over in the West Coast in California. In the early 90s, the apocryphal story I like to say is that Jack was looking at this and saying, look, you know, Biz or IBA market data only has a few fields in it. I can certainly do a better job and define those better. And so he created Biz Comps, and it has like 22 fields inside of it. I recommend you go out to bizcomps.com and download their guide. It's a very handy document. I didn't put it in the handouts because it's a lot easier to get to, but bizcomps.com and get their guide and they'll tell you how to use it. But I'm thinking, okay, hey, I can build a better database, and so he did. And most of his comps are coming from the IBBA as opposed to the IBA, and they're being used together. The reason I say that's an apocryphal story is because I asked Jack about it, and he says, well, I like your story better, but really it was about me just trying to stay in business. Jack was a business broker, and he needed to have some idea of what businesses would transact for so that he could sell those businesses at an appropriate level, mostly probably talking to the owners, because owners always think their business is worth a lot more than the value of it is. But in any case, Jack put together bizcomps.com or bizcomps data, and Value Source has been selling it, I want to say since the early 90s, and it's become a real mainstay out there. And that's really the history of this data set, is that Jack put this together and he collects data from brokers, friends of his, and has it. So let me tell you about some of the differences here between Biz Comps and IBA market data. So Biz Comps has two levels here. The first level is a SIC code, and the second level is a NAICS code. And so let me give you an idea of what that looks like. If I put in the 3079 and I press search, I get all of these. I'm not doing a really good job here of erasing my marks, but you can tell that there's one down here that has a different NAICS code. And so I'm sure we've all seen, you know, how do the NAICS codes apply to the old SIC codes, and what does that really look like? And so you can get different codes out here in your NAICS that comes up. Another thing that you can do inside of the Biz Comps that you can't do inside of IBA is you can put in a single digit. So if I put in 3, I'm going to get every single SIC code that starts with 3. Now, as you expand from 2 digits or 4 digits up to 3, you know, you can start to get a lot better. You can get broader industry, but more observations is the way I would look at that. And so if I type in just a 3, or maybe let's just say I want a 3-4, and if I press search, I can get that kind of data inside of there, and I would come up with all the 3-4s, 3-4-4-1, 4-2, 9-9, but maybe these metal manufacturing companies are close enough for me to draw multiples from. The detailed part of this works exactly the same way. I can type in SIC codes or NAICS codes, and the manufacturer, or the, how do I want to say that, the description is the same thing. It's a Boolean or description inside of the same box, and an and condition outside. So if I type in the word plastics here and I press search, I should get, you know, plastics manufacturing. If I put in manufacturing, you know, I come up with a different set of list. So if I come over here and I put in 3079 and 3089 and press search, You know, you can tell that I'm getting injection molding and stuff like that. Here again, some of the same weaknesses. You know, there's 4 or 5 digits here in the description. Manufacturing of plastic products, that covers a wide range of different types of company. I was listening to a public company transaction webinar once, and somebody was selling John Deere tractors. Well, John Deere makes a lot of different tractors. They make tractors that farmers use, and they make tractors for construction. And selling a business that sells those is going to behave a lot differently. I think you sell construction equipment a little differently than you sell those tractors to farmers. And so, you know, you have to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples, and is there enough information inside of here to do that? That's one of the weaknesses. Something else I wanted to show you on the Biz Comps data set. Let me clear this out and press search again. So we have 12,689 records inside of this data set. And I don't know if you remember, but in IBA it was closer to 33, 35,000, something like that. That's because it goes back 30 years. So let me prove that point to you here by saying, look, let me come over here to the sale date and search this. The high date is June of 2016, pretty current data. If I go from low to high, you can tell that I have transactions inside of here from 2003 and 2004. Jack usually prunes his data at about 10 years, and we happen to be at one of those points in time where he has a couple of extra years added onto here. And he hasn't pruned that data yet, but typically he shows 10 years of data. And so you can use this filter to see exactly, you know what I mean, revenues. If you go from low to high, there's a bunch out here with no revenues. If I go the other direction, high to low, you can get a good idea of what those revenues are. Now the way I use that is that I will come out here and I will do these filters, and that will give me some fodder to put inside of my report. I use the Biz Comps database. Here's a little bit of the history of the database, and here were some of the parameters that were inside of that database. And it gives you a good idea, you know, of saying, look, you know, if I'm dealing with something with $230 million, you know what I mean, that's a lot different than dealing with something with $500,000. And so it gives you an idea of what the database is comprised of. The detailed over here gives you the same search features that we were talking about before. If I just want to do the mountain region, I'm in Pueblo, Colorado, so I can, you know, search on just Colorado and the mountain region, and you can tell that's Colorado, Nevada, Utah, all of those show up over here. And so I can get a regional search and say, is there a difference in regions or not? And then I can also put in a SIC code. Let's just use 5912 and press search. And so now I'm using the intersection. I just want things in the mountain region and things that are 5912, retail pharmacies, and so I only get a few transactions inside of here. I know I'll get asked the question, how many transactions do you need to do a population? My personal preference is over 20, but I've known people to use 5. They say it depends on how close these are and what kind of confidence level they throw off. You know, but the idea is here's market data, and you can use it how you want to. The only thing I didn't show here were the details. When I click on the details, what occurs is this gives you all the records, and this here will give you the details of one of the records. And so these are the fields that are available inside of Biz Comps. When I click on this button over here, I can cycle through those different records and see what those different fields are. Here again, to get the data out, I use the Excel sheets down here, data only or analysis. The analysis is the same thing as the analysis on the IBA, except for that it pulls in just this information. When I click on one of those Excel sheets, my exports gets decremented by 1. So let me erase all of this, and as I recall, I'm trying to get to the Biz Comps file. Might have been easier to download it. So I already downloaded the Biz Comps file for the plastics data set, and it's the same thing. We can go through the same process. I just want to prove it to everyone. You press this here is protected. Okay, it's came from a safe place. Then it's going to ask me to enable the macros. I press enable the macros, and it has all the sheets down here. Here's the about sheet. Here's the data sheet. This is the data only. If you don't have access to macros, you can use the data only. It's those fields. Obviously, the observations are in rows, and the columns are the different field names that exist. Go out to bizcomps.com to get a guide that will explain all of those. Selected transactions, the same thing, true or false. These are the ones that we said, yes, we will use. I don't know if you noticed or not, but there's also a nice little table out here that says how far away from the arithmetic average you are. You can use that to help analyze your data. And you get the same tool set. And just let me come over here to say, here's price to revenue over revenue. That's where we want to get at the end of the day. There's your regression line formula and your R squared. And so it's the same type of deal. Let me come over to done deals and talk a little bit about the done deals history. So done deals was put together by a gentleman, and I'm sorry, I do not remember his name, but this would have been in the 1990s. He would go out to the SEC and he would look at, I don't know, over 250,000 documents and pull out the 8Ks. And the 8Ks look like this. I'm sure we've all seen those, but they talk about mergers and acquisitions. And I'm having a hard time displaying this. Sometimes when you go back and forth too much inside of these GoToMeetings, it doesn't work. But it is an 8K, and so he would review the 8Ks, put that information together inside of a database, and then sell that database. And he was doing this in the, like I say, in the 1990s, I believe, is when this was coming out, and he sold that over to PPC, and then PPC would sell it inside of their stuff along with their software and call it done deals and do the same analysis and the same transactions. And then PPC got bought out by Thomson Reuters. Now Thomson Reuters owns this today. Some of the advantages of using done deals or of going over to the SEC straight away is the way you're able to sort the data. So in other words, all of these transactions are put into a database that have valuation data, valuation concentric data inside of it, as well as the ability to sort by different factors that we would think is appropriate. We have an analysis tool. It's the same analysis tool that I was showing you before with the regression line in it, except for the regression lines are on all of the different multiples. So let me come over here to done deals. And as I said, in the handouts, I have the definitions and I have FAQs. Those are very difficult to come by these days. Feel free to email me if you can't pull them down, but that would be something that I would hold on to and archive. I have a difficult time finding those on the internet today. The same kind of process here. You have standard, you have detailed. But these are private companies that were purchased by a public company, therefore the 8K is showing up. What does that mean to us, and what are some of the issues involved in that? Some of the issues is that you have asset and stock transactions, and so you have to make sure you really understand what it is you're trying to value here and what that needs to be done so that the values make sense to you. There's also a field inside of here that talks about the terms, and you have to read those terms to find out exactly what occurred. In this case here, shares were exchanged for cash, and that's a nice little deal, right? But there's also an 8-year non-compete inside of here. And so how do you put all of that together? But you have to read those terms to find out what happens. Sometimes it's stock for stock trade, sometimes it's stock for money, sometimes it's stocks and loans that were forgiven and loans that were taken out. And so you just have to look at the terms, and what that can do is that can change your pricing multiples from what you are seeing inside of the database. So when people use done deals, I always want to make sure that you're very aware of that particular situation. The other thing you need to see is if I filter this by sales, revenues, and I'll go from from low here, and let me go up a couple pages to give you an idea. So there are transactions in here with $1.6 million in here, but typically you're looking at transactions around $10 million and up, $5 million and up. And so it kind of goes from, I call them super micro businesses. These are the Main Street mom and pop shops, they're selling for a few $100,000 up to a couple $1 million. And then you get into done deals, which are small companies that public companies like. They want to pull in the new technology, or they want to pull in customer lists and affirm their market share. And so they're a little bit on the bigger side, and then you can get into the public company transactions if you're getting into that $50–60 million in revenue and up. And this kind of bridges the gap is where I was trying to go with that information. The data and analysis down here are exactly the same. And so let me pull up the analysis for done deals. And because these are public companies, the multiples are going to be slightly different than what you might be expecting. And that's what I want to show you on here is that you, in the IBA and Biz Comps databases, you're getting basically a seller's discretionary earnings cash flow type multiple. But inside of this transaction data set, you can get a little bit different kinds of multiples, and that's what I wanted to show you. And so you can see there's price to revenue, price to EBITDA, price to earnings, cash flow, price to assets, and you can see those different multiples that are in there. They don't have them all for all of the different companies, but you can look at it and see. The other thing that they have inside of here is that they have the ability to go to the company that purchased it. And so when you look at the data, here's the buyer and their phone number. And so you can actually go out there and contact that buyer if it's a recent transaction, and they might be able to give you some more information on it. But as I squish down to the end of this data set, you can tell that the only difference is we've added tabs so that you can get transactions, price, that's the multiple histogram, price to assets, and so you can get a regression line on price to assets. And so it takes all of the multiples and creates the regression line, not just the two that were there. So at this point, what I want to do is I want to ask my polling question. It's not really a polling question. If you type in any questions you have, I will answer that after this. But one of the reasons that ValueSource does these webinars is to offer hands-on experiences of the different things that you can see. In this case here, this would be a BV Data World. If you haven't had access to our BV Data World, I know some of you out there have the Titanium, and you saw a lot of new things that maybe you didn't see before, and hopefully you picked up some ideas on how to be more efficient with your searches. We sell software. We sell a Damages Advocate, which is also a personal injury. So if somebody gets hurt in a car accident and they need to find out exactly what the present value of the future loss is, they can you can use that for that as well. And so I will close this in about 10 more seconds. And it doesn't matter if you really want a hands-on experience of something. Like I said, reach out to me and I can connect you to the right people. So I'm going to close this in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let me summarize here and then pick up the questions. So hopefully we went through the IBA, market data, Biz Comps, and done deals. You have an idea of what the history of those databases were, how they came to be. You know, IBA and Biz Comps were put together for business brokers to sell businesses, and the valuation community lobbed onto those and said, hey, if there's a marketplace that's selling these at this price, that must be the fair market value. Done deals is built off of 8K. You can go out to the SEC, Edgar, and verify that information if you want to see those 8Ks. And you have to be careful with the done deals data set because you have to make sure you manage your multiples in an appropriate manner, depending on what you're valuing and what your standard of value is. You should have learned a lot about the strengths and weaknesses of the data. Having 2 or 3 word descriptions is not necessarily going to tell you what that industry is. That's why when you have a very small data set, you have to ask yourself, is this really, you know, printing companies? You have to be wary that, you know, the items may or may not. I'm not saying that in the right way. You have to look at the reasonableness of those comparable transactions and see if they're appropriate to use for your purposes. Just because they exist in the database doesn't mean anything. A good example of that, and I'm not sure I brought it up, would be liquor stores. Liquor stores are supposed to be sold without the inventory, and sometimes the inventory is included on the comp deal, and you can tell that if you start looking at the comps. But you know, just because the definitions are there doesn't mean that that's how it was reported. So you have to be careful of the strengths and weaknesses. The strengths is that market data. You know, what better, we're supposed to go out there and say, what would somebody buy this for? What better way to say somebody bought this in the past for this? And so, you know, that's a pretty good strength. So let me pull up the questions here. The question says, are these databases updated on an ongoing basis? And the transaction data are showing pretty old. Well, I'm going to say that the transaction databases, Biz Comps is updated every 4 or 5 months, you know, 2-3 times a year. IBA data is updated when there are new transactions enough to update them, so we get 100 or 200 inside of those. Here again, I would suggest going out and either getting the hands-on experience, reaching out to me, and we can go through and look at those. But I believe that all the transactions I were looking at, the latest ones, the most current ones, were June of 2016, and here we are just in November. So I think that those are pretty current transactions, and certainly you can exclude older transactions if you want to. And somebody is suggesting here the seminar is it going to be given again? And the answer is I don't know if we're going to give a seminar again, but I'm certainly hoping to post most of this information as a video on our website. So we'll see. We'll see. So we'll go from there. I don't have any more questions at this point. I just wanted to give you another contact at ValueSource. Her name is Tanya Fody. She would be another person to reach out to if you want to get a hands-on experience. She's not a evaluator, but she can certainly get you set up with the permissions. And if you have questions on the actual data, hopefully I've proven to you that I can get a hold of Jack, and you know, I can talk to PPC about. I'm sorry, it's Thomson Reuters now, about the done deals, and say, okay, what's really going on with this? And they can give me information and I can get it back to you. So hopefully you got those handouts over here in the column. Those 2 from done deals are hard to come by. The 2 from the IBA are always nice to have in your library. You know, here's how the IBA data is supposed to be used from the person who created it. They were written by Ray Miles. What's included in the selling price, that's always a big conversation piece out there. And of course the slide deck, and the slide deck is really nothing more than giving you a place to get my information. I'm out on LinkedIn, Dave Miles CPA. You can look me up. I'll be happy to connect with you. I want to thank you for spending the last hour with me. Hopefully it was beneficial to you and you learned something. I know I had a good time doing it. So thank you very much, and I will close this out here in a couple minutes.